What's up, Seventh Hour? This is our third part of our DBQ review for our AP exam. I also posted today. I was pretty surprised by the length when it was all said and done, but a pretty in-depth look at what the AP exam will look like from like a technology standpoint this year. So please let me know what questions you have about that. Again, Wednesday, we have an optional period 8 DBQ assessment. This will help you get points back in the test category. We do want it done by the end of the day Wednesday, though. It's the same kind of modified DBQ style that will be on the exam, so it's a great chance to try and do that as a little practice run. So we're going to dive more into document use today and start to explain some of the first differences we see in what is our modified DBQ rubric. So far, we spent our first day talking about context, right? The first thing someone should read in your DBQ is you setting the scene for the topic. We use the Star Wars scrawl or crawl as our kind of benchmark, right? It's about 3 sentences. It uses cleared details in its terminology. It says it in a detailed yet clear way. So our ideas there was, let's do about 3 sentences. Let's stay on topic and about 20 years prior. Yes, there's some wiggle room there, but make sure it's context that addresses with the topic at hand, and it's not just on topic and super far ago, but still relevant. So our prompt that we've been practicing with is a compare and contrast question, right? About the goals, strategies, and support of these two different kind of movements in the civil rights era. So we got to come down to a conclusion. Do they want the same things? Do they go about it the same way? And do people support them to the same level? We're saying yes or no. And these were some class examples we had of proper context, right? Leading us up to that point. So this one did a great job talking about the years, using Harlem Renaissance, Scottsboro case to establish creative actions of African American communities and some injustices they faced. This was another one using Jim Crow laws, using Jackie Robinson as kind of an example of a spokesperson. This is a kind of good visual we use to try and come to our thesis, right? So do we find that this integrationist phase had the same goals, wanted the same things, had the same level of support and the same strategies as the Black Power phase? Or do we think that these two kind of groups had very, very different goals, strategies, and supports? So we always use the same exact thesis statement we've done all year with DBQs and with LAQs. We introduce it with our first sentence using complexity counter arguments. We then introduce our best points of argument that support our answer, and then we answer our prompt. And the why is very important. It should be crystal clear, it should be able to stand on its own, it should address the prompt perfectly. These were our documents. We'll come back to them in a little bit. But let's take a look at one I thought was a very good job. This was our Carol Captain of the Week. This one's Annette. Way to go, Annette. Round of applause for Annette. Woo. And we're going to dive into hers quite a bit here. Let's read it first, though. Here's the thesis statement. As Africans began to confront the discrimination they experienced, the SCLC, a pacifist group advocated by Martin Luther King, and fierce groups like the Black Panthers solely fought for the equal rights of African Americans through protests supported by the African community and led by African leaders. So we know this is our X, right? And we're seeing what's in common between these two movements. And what we see in common is that they both are fighting for equality for African Americans. They both have strong leaders. Okay, that's something in common. However, the protests in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 were nonviolent, as Martin Luther King intended to force the desegregation, and the statement by the minister of the Black Panthers encouraged Africans to arm themselves and physically fight against the repression of the California legislature. So big differences. This first phase, led by Martin Luther King, this integrationist phase, is trying to use nonviolent methods, while the second phase, this Black Power phase, is actually promoting physical violence. Okay, so let's see their why, their answer to the prompt. And notice that they do a good job going into detail here. This could stand on its own. Therefore, The nonviolent phase and the Black Power phase were different since the nonviolent group's goal was to peacefully achieve equality with strategies involving pacifist speeches and protests supported by peacemakers like King, whereas the Black Panthers are more of an aggressive group whose goal was to rally the people with violent protests in order to gain equality. It's very clear here that their conclusion is that these groups are different. And notice that it doesn't just say these two groups are different. No, it gives an example, right? It goes in to say that the strategies were different, and here's how they're different. Integrationist phrase using pacifist speeches, nonviolent protests. Got guys like Martin Luther King. Black Panthers, on the other hand, not doing that. You might want to throw in the years here, just even like in parentheses, like the years of the two movements, but very well done. Here's how you can kind of visualize it in terms of each kind of idea. I even threw in the doc numbers here. So this isn't necessarily something you'd have to do in your thesis, the doc numbers. That's going to come later in our paper when we start to cite them, right? But this isn't just kind of vague generalities. Notice that, and that's not diving deep into each document's kind of hip or anything like that, but she's doing a very good job at least referencing them. I was able to, no problem, know exactly which documents she's referring to. In her X, she refers to documents 1 and documents 5. She didn't just pull this information out of the ether. In her A and B, I can clearly see her A is going to be document 2. And her B is going to be document 5. Yes, notice that you can use the same document in different ways. Absolutely. That's not a problem. So you can see how this is kind of broken down in a very good way. It's very impressed with that. So what we're going to be doing, though, is to try and see how the rubric is kind of shifted a little bit. Because for the most part, it's the same. There's nothing new. I just want to make that very clear. There's nothing new to the rubric in terms of what's asking you to do. It's just asking you to do maybe some more of things than we might be accustomed to. So let's look at some evidence points we're going to be shooting for. You can get a single point here by using the content of at least 2 documents to address the topic of the prompt. So that's more of just kind of establishing a document's place in history. You're talking about what the document is saying, but you're not really using it for an argument. That's what this difference is with these 2 points. You can get a point by just kind of establishing a document, using it to describe what's going on in history, doing that twice with 2 of the 5 documents, and that's you a point. But going and using it to support an argument that this is what this document did in history, and here's why it shows commonalities, or here's why it shows differences. That's how you get that other point. Now, if you want this third point, you're going to need to use 4 of the 5 documents in response to the argument. Notice that's not 4 of the 5 addressing the topic, it's 4 of the 5 in response to the argument. That's the same kind of scale we saw with the other DBQ, because in that one it was 6 out of the 7. This one, though, it's 4 out of the 5. Okay? Now, in terms of our establishing context, audience, point of view for our documents, that's slightly different too. You can get 1 point for doing this for 1 document, establishing its purpose, its contextualization, its audience. That you can get a point from for doing that for 1 document. Now, there's a second point there for doing it again, additionally for another document. So just like with a regular DBQ, I would suggest doing this more than twice just to give yourself kind of the best chance of getting these points. But if you successfully hit a document once, you get a point. If you successfully hit a second document, you get an additional point. So notice how we're seeing 5 points total here. Using 2 documents to just talk about the prompt, the topic, get you a point. Another point if for 2 of these documents, you use them to establish your argument, and those can be the same 2 documents, right? Like this is kind of the first step towards that. And then if you do this for 4 documents, you get that third point. Right? If you successfully do it for 1 document, a 4th point. You successfully do it for a second document, a 5th point. Make sure that you're kind of organizing your thoughts here. This is the same structure we've always used. A lot of people with their thesis their thesis they posted weren't really addressing documents directly. They were being very vague. So kind of to ensure you're using all the documents, kind of plan ahead, right? Paragraph 1 has that contextualization, the thesis. Paragraph 2, which documents am I going to use to show my counter? For paragraph 3, which document am I going to use to really try and prove I'm right with my thesis? Paragraph 4, what documents are going to still be left over to really help me prove I am correct in my historical assertion? Remember that this is a very helpful form, and I posted it again for you, the proper way to hip. But make sure when you're hipping that you're keeping this aspect in mind, this idea of argument. Don't hip a document to simply address the topic, right? It's more than that. You hip the document to use it, turn it into a tool. Don't just simply hip a document to describe its place in history. Hip a document to prove what you're saying. Use it in response to an argument. By following this kind of organization, you should have no problem using 4 documents addressing the argument, not just the topic, and at least hipping 2 documents. So what I'd like you to do is to pick one of our 5 documents. I'd like you to try to properly hip it in our discussion board. Now, make sure that you're keeping this part in mind. Do not just simply hip it addressing the prompt. That's just descriptive history, right? Try to make sure it's addressing an argument. So even though we won't have your thesis in front of us, we should be able to tell based on how you're describing this document and how you're using it if you feel like this document's proving these 2 phases were more similar or more different. Please let me know how I can help. I'm excited to see what you come up with.